פורים שמח.
היי קרן, מה שלומך?
בסדר, מה שלומך?
שמעתי אותך קצת מקוטע, אבל עכשיו בסדר. מקווה שאת שומעת אותי
סליחה,
טוב.
כן, וסליחה על הבלבול.
לטובה.
אנחנו בשעון קיץ, אז רציתי, בדרך כלל זה שבע תפרש, רציתי להיות בטוחה שיהיה בלבול נוסף.
Better safe than sorry.
היי.
Can you hear me as well? So I was like online at 8 a.m.
Yeah, no, now I know, אבל לפני שזה קרה, רציתי, כי בדרך כלל אני יודעת פחות או יותר בעל פה מה השעה בישראל, אני חשבת את זה בראש, אבל אחרי השינוי לא הייתי בטוחה, אתם גם או שאתם לא, אבל אתם יותר נכונים, כי פשוט קשה ככה, לילדים זה קשה.
אני חשבתי שאנחנו המשוגעים היחידים עם שעון חורף.
And they closed the city.
What do you mean? Because
it
of the
was
truckers?
a crazy weekend of the demonstration.
Okay.
So the hotel called us and said, well, listen, if you're coming from outside, you can enter the city. So,
anyway, זו עיר, אני לא גרה שם, זו עיר קצת משעממת.
חשבתי שגר באוטווה, דודלתי?
לא, אני כמובן מאז הקוביד עובדת רק בבית, אבל קודם הייתי נוסעת פעמיים בשבוע.
אוקיי, אז איפה את גרה?
מוריאל.
אוקיי.
הרבה יותר תוסס ומסיבות טובות, לא מסיבות של הפגנות ובעיות.
כן, היינו שם בקיץ, האמת, והיה מדהים. כאילו, היא מאוד, יש לה וייב כזה של תל אביב.
כן, ממש, ממש. אני חושבת שזה קצת ערבוב בין משהו כמו תל אביב או ניו יורק ועיר אירופאית.
נכון.
יש גם את קבק, לא, זה מדהים, זאת אומרת, עכשיו אין כלום, כי הרי אפילו המסעדות היו סגורות עד לפני 3 שבועות פתחו, לא הלכתי מאז, אבל רק פתחו, הכל היה פשוט סגור.
כן.
אנשים עדיין עובדים מהבית.
כן, גם פה זה ממש מטורף, איך שזה נמשך ונמשך. אני מקווה, אבל הנה, עכשיו אולי נראה שינוי, אומרים שבאונטריו מורידים את המסכות.
כן, אני חושבת שאי אפשר לנבא מה יהיה, אבל אני חושבת שננשום כמה חודשים, ואחרי זה בסתיו נראה מה מחכה.
כן, אני יודעת, אחותי עובדת הרבה עם סין, כאילו במרקטינג, והם רק מדברים על זה שיש another way, וכאילו ש...
כן, אבל יש גם השלכות חברתיות שצריך להבין אם בהמשך נפעל לנצח או שיהיה אחרת.
אני הראשונה להסכים איתך. אני ממש חושבת שצריך לחשוב איך אנחנו מתחילים לחיות עם זה. Anyway.
What can you do? One day at a time. אבל אני מאוד מקווה שזה יסתדר להיות בישראל בקיץ. או ביוני, אז טלנו אולי נדבר בהזדמנות אחרת, אבל אני פשוט מתה לצאת מכיסא ולא רק להסתובב בבית. anyway.
כן, זה קשה.
אבל בישראל פורים עוד מעט אני חושבת, אנשים חוזרים לשגרה או שלא השנה?
עכשיו כן, לחלוטין בישראל מתנהגים כאילו זה לא קיים.
יופי. זה נשמע מרענן.
עד שיהיה לנו גל נוסף, בדיוק
נכון.
היה דיווח בעיתון על איזה 2 נושאים שהגיעו ארצה עם זן לא מוכר.
כן, כן. כן.
יש למה לצפות, מה שנקרא.
אז נהנה בקיץ כמה שאפשר. לפחות זה. בוא ננסה, לא יודעת.
את מתכננת לנסוע לכל הקיץ? או חלק?
אני חושבת שחלק. אבל כמה שאפשר, אם כבר, אז זה לא, פעם הייתי נוסעת ל-48 שעות. באמת, הייתי נוסעת כמה פעמים בשנה, 48 שעות, הלוך חזור וזהו. אבל עכשיו אני חושבת, לא נסעתי מאז 2020 לשום מקום, אני חושבת שזה כבר בלתי אפשרי לעשות דברים כאלה עם כל הלוגיסטיקה, הבנתי שזה מסובך אפילו
And you also be out of practice, את תמצאי את עצמך יפה נורא בחזרה, מה שכבר פעם היית מתורגלת.
I'm so out of practice, it's funny, because I have my first in-person conference in Ottawa, April 25th, and another one May 12th, and after 20 years of public speaking, I have to say, and I don't mind that this is being recorded, I'm scared. I gave a talk in the States, I think 2 weeks ago, and they said to me at the conclusion, the polite, and we hope to see you in person one day. And they said, I think if you see me in person, we'll have to put a screen in the conference room because I don't think I can speak. I can speak in person anymore. I've developed some form of agoraphobia. I think we all have.
At least it's not recorded. So.
It is recorded. I think it's already recorded.
Oh, it's going to be recorded?
Okay, now with telemedicine, I mean, it's not a technical diagnosis. It's my own appreciation of the situation. Yeah, no, now everything's
the weather looks spectacular on your end. The weather looks spectacular, huh?
So part of it is deceiving because, it is by Israeli standards. I assume that you would be freezing because it's about 0 to 1. But for us, 0 degrees is like a most joyful occasion.
It's like not that far apart. It's 3 in Jerusalem right now, or 4.
Yeah, it's...
we had a snowy Purim yesterday.
Really?
Yes, we had snow for about 2 minutes, but it was there.
But it's nice when you don't have it and then you have it. It's joyful. When you have it for 6 months
of the year. Fake foam, Gadi. I don't think there was real snow.
We always have a snowy Purim and many times a snowy Pesach. So yeah. Chag Aviv.
Well, in Canada, snowy August isn't even that unheard of.
No, exagère pas. We have the worst of both worlds. In July, August, it's Chom Yuli August. It's lach v'cham kmo b'Israel. It's not, no, we have the worst weather-wise. We're blessed in other respects, but weather-wise, I find, at least in Montreal, we have the worst of possible worlds weather-wise. We do enjoy a good May, June, so yeah. What can you do? We have bigger problems than the weather in the world, but the weather is more fun to talk about. Which is why the title is very
not for long. It's gonna be this is gonna be the number one problem. It is the number one problem.
That's true. That's actually
so even that we won't have that for long.
Very true. Yeah, very true. I didn't think of it in those terms because I'm clearly very short-sighted. But yes, that's very true.
Right.
Okay.
And on that positive note, let's talk about immortality.
No spoilers, Karen. I still need to introduce you. Okay, so hello, everyone. I see that we are joined by Tal Morse, I guess. Lovely to have you here with us. Welcome. Feel at home. We are delighted to have with us Karen Eltis, which is both friend of the faculty and our center. And other than that, she works she teaches law at the University of Ottawa in the Center of Law, Technology and Society. And she's also a full professor of law in the Faculty of Law, Civil Law section, I'm sorry. Karen specializes in artificial intelligence, innovation law, and policy and cybersecurity from a comparative perspective. She serves as senior advisor to the National Judicial Institute and has taught also in Columbia Law School. And she is a past affiliate with Princeton Center of Information Technology Policy. Today, as she told us, she will discuss, do you really want to live forever? Alphaville retrospective, no. Digital immortality and posthumous personality rights. We really look forward to hear your presentation, Karen, and we even look forward even more to the possibility of hosting you in Israel in 2022 and to work on your new arrived stage fright. So thank you very much, and the floor is officially yours.
Thank you, Tal. Shalom lekulam. Thank you so much for your kind invitation and for hosting me, albeit on Zoom. And I do very much look forward to hopefully seeing you in person this June. And yes, it's funny that you mentioned stage fright because law was kind of an offshoot of my initial love of theater. So yes. That will hopefully be vanquished soon. Today's theme, I think we're moving, and my research has focused, as you mentioned in your kind introduction, on artificial intelligence, which was the flavor of the day in terms of law and technology. And now we're sort of moving, technology takes different forms. I think we need to look at principles in the law, but if we're looking at the forms that it takes, probably the next form is that of the metaverse. And just to preface, Mark Zuckerberg himself, if I'm not mistaken, spoke, and I can relate to that, of us living during the pandemic as we were on Hollywood squares, right? These two-dimensional, for the most part, little squares with which our interaction is very limited, and his hope and intention that the metaverse would lead us to the possibility of this type of world that is interactional, three-dimensional, and so on, which led me to think of living forever potentially in the form of a digital avatar, and how the law might deal with the resuscitation of the dead in the metaverse. And I'm using this term metaverse just very basically defined as a series of interconnected 3D realms, if you will. And of course, those more technically versed can provide more detailed definitions. But for our purposes, the next step from our current virtual platforms, if you will. And this, to situate it in the greater context of legal inquiry, is part of seeing around the proverbial corner, which I think as jurists we need to do. We need to consider how the law will frame, and this is the recurring theme in all of our research, how the law will frame the issues that arise from these virtual environments in which we increasingly live. So the broader topic, I think relevant to whatever immediate point that we address, is that we've moved our lives. I think at this point, it's almost banal to say, from the brick and mortar world to the cyber realm, whatever form that may take, be it for education, be it for health, and for the topic of the day, which is the afterlife, so to speak. And the law has yet to frame this type of interaction. And I just want to preface my words specific to the metaverse and resuscitation by saying that from the onset, I drill this onto my students. I'm not one to say the law hasn't kept up, the law needs to chase. On the contrary, and we could talk about this in the context of my other project, about a paradigm shift that is the Industrial Revolution, one where our terminology, found concepts shift, for instance, in the context of consent to rights and precautionary principles. So how our legal life, our conceptual tools might shift to better fit the fourth industrial revolution, rather than simply chasing after particular technological changes. So I think the way to look at it, and I'm going to speak more specifically, but I heard of two anecdotal issues in Israel that are in the forefront of legal news that seem relevant. I heard, and we could talk about this, the question period, that there was a woman in front of the High Court of Justice for some sort of remedy for her own murder while she was alive. So I wonder how that translates in the metaverse. I don't know if you've heard of that. And the new law allowing fallen soldiers, excuse me, to procreate. So I think these issues, even though the point to think critically, and this is the goal for today, about how the laws doesn't move existence is smart technology. And even though I'm not offering specific solutions, I'd like to inspire further this metaverse, this immersive virtual reality environment. We see this converging with what's called the death tech industry. It's an industry that promises a digital afterlife and comfort to the bereaved. This is not surprising in light of, as I've mentioned, the pandemic that kind of makes us at this point two-dimensional avatars of us all, and also socioeconomic constraints. I don't know if anybody here has seen the Spielberg movie Ready Player One, But in that context, we see how individuals deprived of certain luxuries due to the devolution of socioeconomic conditions are relegated to the metaverse, where they are able to travel and to engage in behaviors that they can no longer do in the brick and mortar world. So that's true more generally. And the immortality component is one that ranges from Microsoft's new chat box, which is modeled on a friend, a relative, an acquaintance that can become an avatar. And how does this happen? Same as AI, and that's the intersection, predictive analytics that mimic the deceased. They have a collection. We all leave, and we've probably seen this in notarial law, we leave a bundle of digital traces. We've spoken about it in a different context. These can be cultivated, reaped, and sowed, and then with machine learning, with artificial intelligence, to recreate the deceased in the digital realm. And you couple artificial intelligence with the metaverse as I define it, and the deceased is no longer just a collection of emails or chats or social media remnants, but in fact takes on a live dimension. I mentioned, I think in the summary, the dystopian Black Mirror episode, Be Right Back, and we could talk about it in the questions, where AI-powered technologies allow a woman to interact with her deceased spouse. And from TV fiction to reality, we've seen not long a Korean mother recently reuniting, so to speak, with her lost daughter, her deceased daughter, in virtual reality. So metaverse takes it a step beyond. And this attracted, and my son would tell me if this is a good amount or not, but 20 million views on YouTube. So good or not good, it was somewhat popular, one could say. So out of these anecdotes, and I'm going to summarize it, the main ones, Microsoft's chat box, right, where you can communicate with the deceased based on previous communications. The Black Mirror dystopian episode, and the actual North Korean mother. What might the law have to say about digital immortality, resuscitating or recreating a disembodied version of a deceased loved ones with morsels of data? So we might think this is seemingly straightforward, but for those of you who have looked at social media accounts after death and the contradictory case law that has emerged, certainly in the States, and the amount of uncertainty at the time, how might the law approach these thornier questions? And these questions, and the reason I raise them, are at our doorstep, right? And yet we have not managed as a legal community in the democratic world for now to reflect on something as simple as inheriting social media accounts. So what happens to things like posthumous consent? These are the main issues that I want to raise, though not dwell on given the limited time. Posthumous consent, and that is as problematic as consent in the digital world generally, but all the more so. So if we're using consent as the pierre angulaire, which I argue in different contexts we're shifting away from, how might that work when the interests of the deceased and those of their family, we can see, are not identical? And we can glean from surveillance of dementia patients. We can glean from, in Canada, a topic that is very relevant is the right to die, and so on. What happens when there is not an intersection of interests, reputational rights and erasure, and privacy? So all these, privacy and dignity, all these are brought to bear in these contexts, and they were recently explored for those of you, and I think most of us here are in academia, by a university here in Montreal, where I live, using a deceased professor's lectures. The deceased professor is continuing to give his courses with the correction assistant and with the consent of his family, although we don't know what his perspective would be on that. So I'm going to give just a few additional words to situate us, and then raise some of the issues in greater detail and open up to questions. I haven't asked how much time I have, so I'll wait for a good interruption. Michael Graziano, who's a professor of neuroscience at Princeton, spoke of the metaverse and following death in these terms, not in legal terms, but we might keep them in our minds. He says, imagine that a person's brain could be scanned in great detail and recreated in a computer simulation. The person's mind, memories, emotions, and personality could be duplicated. In effect, a new and equally valid version of that person would now exist in a potentially immortal digital form. This is called mind uploading. Okay, so he refers to it in this manner. The science of the brain and consciousness increasingly suggests that this mind uploading is possible. What emerges, therefore, is not a single you, but a topologically intricate version, a hyper you with two or more branches. One of those branches is going to be mortal, and the others have an indefinite lifespan, depending on how long the computer platform is maintained. And then he continues, I'm quoting him, at the simplest level, mind uploading would preserve people in an indefinite afterlife. Families could have Christmas dinner with grandma joining on a video conference. So we could think of our, Pesach on Zoom for those of us who have done it. The tablet screen propped up at the end of the table. But unlike a traditional heaven, he continues, this is still a quote, it isn't a separate world. It's seamlessly connected to the real world. Your connection, this is the deceased connection, to the larger world is almost entirely through digital means. What happens, he asks, when older generations never die, but remain active in society? There is no reason, he says, to think that the living will have any political, economic, or intellectual advantage over the simulated. End of quote. So this is replete with legal questions, and my immediate purpose is merely to raise them. How does this play out? And as my colleague Alan Mendelsohn, who lectures for privacy law at McGill, says, internet law is everything and nothing. So we can think about this touching on so many different areas. And this is, my purpose is just to raise it in order to highlight the shortcomings of the current approach. And this is not to say, because I completely reject the usual refrain of the law must chase after specific technologies, but rather reconceptualize our foundational principles to lend themselves specifically, and here I get to some of the specific issues which I'll highlight and end on. Who can be a rights holder, right? And there's parallels with robot law. The capacity and expression of choices and consent, much of it, certainly in various legal traditions, including the civil law to some extent, but the common law more generally, relates to awareness. You can suffer harms if you were aware of those harms. We see that in civil liability. You can consent as long as you have some capacity. What happens in this scenario? And I draw our collective attention to something that I referenced earlier on, which is the fallen soldiers and the potential of procreating. And I think that's an interesting point of reference, even though the issues are different, but I think we can learn by analogy. First of all, the cooling off period is something that I heard. My information is obviously just secondary. And the intersection, and this is something that I've highlighted and I want to raise again, the assumption that the law makes in many contexts that there's an intersection of interests between next of kin, it's done for civil liability and so on, and the deceased, that is something that we might revisit because children and family members are probably at a different level of interest, particularly after the death in certain cases. As it stands, and we can get into this in the question period, the dead in current systems of law, and certainly common law, and there's a brilliant article on this more generally, not related to new technologies, have very few rights. The only time very few posthumous rights, including to privacy, reputation, all the matters I mentioned, as a curieux, and this might be a piece de solution, in France, posthumous marriage is possible, but only to render the children legitimate. And there is a slight opening for defamation. So this is something that we might wish to explore, although these are all piecemeal individualistic responses to systemic problems. So I'm going to before my voice gives up, I'm going to conclude with just a few thoughts, and then we can have a discussion. Again, the purpose is merely to highlight how the law might begin to respond to these issues. And we could talk about differences in common law and civil law on a conceptual, on a principled level, rather than a pigeonhole one. When I began law school, the first brilliant professor, Daniel Jutras, talked about, some of you might know, the Kafka-Max Brod dilemma, and honoring the wishes of the dead versus perhaps greater considerations or other considerations of loved ones, including in this case of Brod to spread Kafka's publication. Ironically, in this career of focusing on new technologies and cybersecurity, in the context of the dead assimilating with the living in this digital immortality, many of these issues of posthumous legal rights find association to this initial dilemma. I think some of the interests will be, and some of the solutions will find their bearings in the twin pillars of the civil law, which are dignity and autonomy, in the face of technology that might one day be able to tell our stories, to tell our personal stories and the stories of our lives without our permission. And Ian Kerr has a fascinating piece on brain tech. So ensuring that a current approach would be able to take into account our wishes when it tells our story. I don't know, and I'm looking at the time, I don't know, Tal, if we do best to conclude on these.
If you want, we usually have like 30 minutes of a presentation, and you can have a posthumous presentations as well.
I can have I can have a posthumous presentation for sure. Yeah, so I think in terms of piste de solution, the European Parliament has a proposal that looks at the status of avatars and robots. I'm just going to make some very general thoughts. That's something that we might look at in terms of making choices by analogy. Although I think that the greatest issue in terms of retelling our personal lives without our consent will be that of reputational considerations as it feeds into the type of defamation and misinformation. And there I've spoken in the past about personality rights and the civil law approach and the possibility of looking into how rights might extend to an individual posthumously, and how we might perhaps minimize, as in other areas, and I think it comes to this in the terminology, the law has rested since the Industrial Revolution, and I note this in other research, on consent. As in recent Canadian jurisprudence that I cite elsewhere, and in recent European jurisprudence with regards to AI, the status of consent is increasingly weakened. And that's a good segue to other areas of research, moving towards a precautionary principle of human rights and harm prevention. So I wonder if that's something that we might harness. But again, and I think I'll really end on this because I sort of would like to nurture our discussion on how we might entertain these matters in a coherent conceptual framework, which sweeps aside ill-equipped notions such as consent, which is difficult posthumously, and how this identity that might survive as the deceased might coexist alongside the living, how the law might best approach this. So I thank you for your attention, and this is obviously a developing topic, and I hope that we can, our common reflections can further nurture the path forward.
Thank you very much, Karen. Very interesting, and we have a first question by Yuval, please.
I have many questions, Karen, so I don't
Me
know.
too.
So I don't know. I mean, let's see how it goes. But I think it's a great agenda. I mean, it really pushes us to engage, you know, with very difficult literally existential issues. Yeah. So when you're talking about France and being able to marry posthumously, I mean, I recall that there was this woman who married the Eiffel Tower in France and made a video out of that. So maybe it really it builds on a more open-ended approach to marriage. So I think one area which is interesting and is developing is the within the EU there is this new declaration on digital rights and principles, which has been adopted late January. So it's like 2 months ago. And one of the rights that they have, which is directly related to your ideas, is the right to digital legacy, which basically involves the ability or the power to determine what happens with publicly available information about you posthumously. So I think there is already at least the buds of some regulation are there, because as you indicate, I mean, the issue of consent is really a big issue. So that's one point which I thought is interesting to further develop. What is this idea of digital legacy? How do you go about? Who is responsible for ascertaining the wishes of the individual, etc. Secondly, I think this also relates to the issue of transparency. And in AI, although you mentioned AI is something already passé.
I mean, it works hand in hand. So.
Right. Well, we are all now dealing with passé. There is an endless, I mean, the number of jokes about this and quips is indefinite, or is infinite. So yeah, I mean, the idea of being transparent about being, you know, engaging with the chat box, I think this is another issue. So this is another dimension which would need to be somehow regulated. So if you are, if you're talking with someone who is no longer physically alive, I think as the counterpart to that conversation, you may have a legitimate interest in actually knowing that you're there. Third, I think there is this issue about, I mean, I was quite concerned as an academic, although I have tenure. So of course, once you have tenure, things are different. But you know, when Coursera started, we were all concerned, I mean, about this new model that you don't need so many professors. There will be like 10% of the top professors. They will record their Coursera courses, and then everyone could attend them. And most of the existing professors would be redundant. Now, I mean, your vision is even more radical. You'll only need 1% I mean, they could be the best of all ages, and they will dominate the market of teaching. So maybe, but more seriously, I think there is an issue about, I mean, you have these discussions about retirement and about substitution. The more people stay in the market, in the job market, in the market of ideas, in the posthumously, I think there may be a crowding out issue. I haven't thought about it fully, but I think it's there is something scary about this notion that, you know, your mother-in-law could continue to chastise you till you're well in your 200s, even on the meta. So there is something which is a bit, and finally, and that's, I think we are, when talking about predictive algorithms, I think there is this deep concern about datafication. And this is something Daphna is also working on in her PhD project. I mean, treating humans basically as, you know, generators of data about future conduct. And I think that these ideas are really taking it to the next level, because they really emphasize not only the ability to simulate and predict human conduct, but actually to continue to basically view the physical personality at some point as completely redundant and continuing to develop outside the four corners of the personality. And that, of course, could have very deep moral implications about what is it to be human, and why do we value human life. So these are just some very initial thoughts about this agenda, which I think is really exciting. So thank you for sharing with us this agenda. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. So if I may quickly address it, it's a tremendous honor to be here. And my apology about this general theme is that, of course, it's meant to susciter la réflexion. And the only difficulty with doing so in an initial manner is that it touches upon so many areas of law, including one that you mentioned, which I'll just touch on briefly, which is employment law, that I'm not an expert in, but it's significant ramifications. So this idea of the metaverse and 3D and avatars and continuing, as you put, Professor Sheni, our personality, that is the concern which ties the metaverse into artificial intelligence. We've said many times that what distinguishes artificial intelligence, what we want from it, is the capacity for it to think for itself, right? For us not to have, we want oversight, but the tension is we want it to be able to think for itself. And that's where we've seen difficulties in the context of discrimination and others, that it is autonomous. So the difficulty, I think, in the metaverse is, as you put it, that the artificial intelligence joined with the metaverse will continue the personality of the deceased. So it's not just about, and I thank you for the digital legacy point of the new European regulation. I haven't looked at it thoroughly, but as I understand it, it focuses on legacy, what we leave behind. And there is a component that is additional here, with the metaverse, married with AI, if you will, which is that the deceased continues in their activities, fueled by the AI. So it's not just that the deceased is giving courses based on what they've said in the past, but in fact, the deceased, based on its AI's understanding of it and the metaverse's 3D vision and related universe, might make us formulate new thoughts, thoughts that are separated from the person we used to be. So that's where, digital legacy instruments may be helpful, but to me still address just this initial, what do you do with what you have already, or perhaps some decontextualization, whereas this, as you said, raises significant moral and philosophical notions, and we could think about it. And I know we're a bit all over the place because the purpose is just to stimulate reflection, but in the context of disinformation, political personalities being revived, right, based on their writings, who can then move beyond what they've said de leur vivant in their living. Yes. And family members on a very basic level. I mentioned family members because the conundrum is more immediately here and less so, but we can see how, like social media, it could devolve into other things. The link, since you mentioned AI, to me, there's a geopolitical aspect, and it's difficult to address all these issues. But of course, everything we do now online feeds AI and allows it to develop. And there's, of course, and it's beyond the scope of the talk, but there's a geopolitical stake in the United States of saying, we don't want certain laws and regulations interfering with the AI sophistication because we need to be ahead of the game. And so that is a concern in terms of any type of regulation that will limit these types of endeavors going forward, be it with regards to us in our lifetime or us beyond our lifetime. So the question is, what type of framework might we adopt that would allow us to protect, as you say, our very humanity, all while realizing, I think, that the AI revolution, the metaverse revolution, if you will not be stopped. On the contrary, it's fed by the current imperatives of the pandemic. And just a final quick point, because there's so much to say, but I really like, the tenure and the job. We used to say that you can't get a professorial position until the previous generation retires or moves on. But now that seems, and it's funny, but if now that won't happen, there's a larger socioeconomic issue with regards to employment that was so brilliantly summarized. And there's a New York Times piece on the Black Plague and the revolution of workers after the Black Plague and the violence that ensued because of socioeconomic considerations. There are tremendous parallels, and the piece does not dwell on anything futuristic or even presential or technology, but how we've talked about AI taking jobs away from people and how that'll work. Well, what happens if you have a whole crew of very experienced individuals performing certain tasks? But I'll stop on that because I don't have any answers. I only have.
There's a nice quote by Max Planck. I mean, you mentioned paradigms, and Daphna is doing her PhD on paradigms. So Max Planck has this quip that, I mean, a paradigm shifts in science when everyone who held the old paradigm is dead. So in your universe, that will never happen.
It'll never happen. So we'll be more dogmatic than ever.
So the earth would be flat forever.
Exactly. So we should prepare now. Is my only takeaway is let us as legal scholars who are alive legal scholars who coincide with our time and zeitgeist attempt to develop normative tools that might better suit themselves for when we don't have this generational shift, I suppose. No generational shift in mother-in-laws or otherwise.
Thank you very much, Karen. I want to see if our guest, Tal Morse, is interested in commenting as he researches death and society. And we are delighted to have him with us. And as in Israel, hospitality is more important than God. So Tal, would you like to join the conversation?
Thank you for the invitation. I just want to maybe to introduce myself and to say that I study posthumous digital afterlives and posthumous privacy together with Professor Michael Birnak of Tel Aviv University. We did a survey and a report for the Israeli Internet Society here. And later, we also won a grant of the ISF to study the legal ramifications of digital immortality. And once I finalize my visa issues, I am supposed to join the Modern Technology Privacy Law and the Dead at Aston University as a research associate there. So together with Michael Birnak, we study, mostly we focus on posthumous privacy and questions of access to digital remains and how the various actors, the law, the IT corporations and the users all kind of engage in the issues of access to digital remains and all these aspects. And personally, I also study these AI tools that are now emerging and how users respond to these innovations. And my findings so far are that they don't really want to engage with the dead as the developers of these technologies assume. So currently, I don't really have any question or comment, just to introduce myself.
It's such a pleasure to meet you, and I'm so happy you mentioned Michael Birnak because he kindly hosted me back in the in-person days many times as a visiting prof at Tel Aviv University, and I consider him a tremendous mentor. And the topic that we shared and that I regularly bombard him with work on point is courts in the digital age. And I know that he is a leader on point, and I did not know, so I'm delighted now. I'll try to bombard him with more. I did not know that he studies death and technology. And I'm delighted to learn of your work. I suppose my only question, and privacy and posthumous rights, we've done a lot, and even in the context of courts on droit à l'image and privacy and different approaches, the continental approach. We can get into that, but I find that's less exciting, but the content on my end, but the continental approach to privacy and how that might be applied, and the continental approach. And these can go into, can feed our reflections. But I think what is interesting to me as a question is that when we look at digital remains, and I think that's also what the digital legacy regulation is looking at, is kind of what remains. And even the term suggests that. And what I'm curious about, right, is, and that's a valid and extremely important question. But what I wonder when we, at the risk of, you know, being too soup of the day, but when you marry the technologies of the metaverse with the technologies of AI, then we're talking about, and it relates to Professor Shani's comments, of something that is constantly evolving, as opposed to something static that we left behind. And the interesting aspect is also the loss of control, not only of our patrimony, our digital patrimony, which we already have very few answers to, and is an important topic of study, but this now dynamic rather than static personality where you don't have any remains, but in fact, there's something continuing. And it's funny, and I love this terminology of remains because the law has always looked at the dead from the perspective of remains. And putting aside technology, the Quebec law, even now, I have a colleague whose research focuses on how the law protects the deceased, the cadavre, the remains. And it's a fascinating area of law that I don't have obviously as much knowledge about. But what's interesting to me when you throw in technology is that it's no longer what's left behind, but what can continue. With AI, what can continue in an uncontrolled fashion, but also with the metaverse, because of the 3D dimension, what can continue in a way that is paralleling the living, whereas Professor Shani said we might not even know who's living and who's not. And even if we do know, then the dead are alongside the living in similar form. So it's fascinating, and I'd love to read what you and Professor Biernack have written.
So just a quick comment on that. I'm also fascinated by all this ability of AI to generate new content. But a key question is, what is the initial data that you feed the AI, and whether you let the machine be fed by only the public content that we all spread when we were alive, or whether you let the machine go into the private chat, the hidden folders that we have on our computers and laptops and mobile phones. So the questions of who gets access is also applicable to the machine, not only to other humans.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find interesting in this larger geopolitical notion of what we let the AI do, my interest has always been unintended consequences and distortions, so that there's the initial access to the data, but how that data, and we've seen it, ad nauseum with Microsoft's, racist, I forget the name of its, but I think we all know what we're talking about. So the distortion of the initial content. But also the realm, if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that the law is anchored in this very strict division, and they do it in first-year law school, between private and public. And you have the summa divisio, and technology throws a wrench. Like, here I am at home doing work, as are all of us, using this private intermediary. And we've seen that taken to the next level with writing texts and writing emails as the AI now corrects us, right, with autocorrect. So there's access not just to the public content, but all content, has now been public. What can we do that is not mediated by some form of artificial intelligence? In the current state, and I know Israel is more open, but in the current state, at least of the Canadian, the way we've lived the pandemic, there's almost nothing that one can engage in, including smart homes, right? There's almost nothing that one can engage in that is not mediated by AI. So the content that the AI has, the basis, is almost infinite. And that's one issue, absolutely. And then the second issue is the distortion, that it learns, but how does it learn and what does it do? So it has access to our data, which to begin with is difficult. But then what does it do with it? And then that's a problem to begin with. What does it do with it when we're already dead and we can't affect it, and others may have a droit de regard and manipulate, and I've talked about the potential political context. That's yet another layer. It's fascinating, just the beginning. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Karen and Tal. And Tal, Yuval and I will visit you in the next privacy workshop in Tel Aviv. So looking forward to meet you in person. We'll continue our conversation now with Dafna, not so far away from Karen.
Hi, thanks, Karen. It's so interesting, and I think we talked about it in one of our conversations. As I see it, I think perhaps we need to kind of distinguish between digital inheritance and digital being or representation, because digital inheritance and digital legacy, what happens with your digital conduct after you die, that is really related to and established on autonomy, privacy, dignity, etc. But when we talk about the digital, the metaverse, this is a digital representation that will operate while we still live, not only when we die. And I think that the control we have on it, or the connection to our own physical conduct, might be actually weaker than digital legacy. And there, I think it has to do more with the so-called the data you, and it connects to propriety rights and data ownership. What is our rights on that product? I think so. That's one thought that I had, and at the same time, and also I just wanted to comment that really what Yuval mentioned about the EU digital rights, it really, I think it is more based on really the idea of digital legacy or digital inheritance, and this also connects to, it's the same idea that we already seen in the WISIS principles in 2003 about the digital personality. And another thought that I have, and this is more of a question, is how, I mean, when we think about digital personality, how do we need, and you mentioned AI, how do we need to think about the issue of voice recognition, face recognition? Basically, these are the foundations to create this digital personality later on, and should we regulate it differently than other AI products? Should we think about the digital personality when we think about voice recognition? That's about it, I think. Thanks
yeah, no,
again.
thank you, and that's a lot, and I think that's an important distinction, and one that I tried at least to draw through the title, which you raised so importantly, that there's a difference, and that's why I kind of tried to look at the afterlife or resuscitating as some continuity, as opposed to, and even though it's an outgrowth, as opposed to legacy or inheritance that raises more banal challenges that weren't addressed in the same way that the challenges with AI weren't addressed, and now are feeding into greater challenges that take on a new qualitative ilk. And I think, Professor Shani put it so well in this, and I would have gone into philosophy, as I say, or theater if there was a living to be made. But I like, in a meta way, it perhaps undermines or throws into question this link that the law has taken for granted on a very macro level between humanity, as we are understood, embodied, and legal rights. So I think here, this sort of anecdotal issues that I raised, and that's why I didn't want to go too much into solutions, but eventually tend to undermine this necessary link, be it in employment law or anywhere else that we could mention, between humanity, the human form, and human rights. And the difficulty, one of the most, in my years in law school, the most obvious but shocking comment as a law student to me was when doing my LLM at Hebrew University, Professor Ruth Gavizon said, we like to separate, and this is maybe controversial, but I think it has its place here. We like to separate between law and politics, but law is the ultimate product of the political process. And it seems so intuitive. Why do I say this? Because this will tie in, regulating this on any macro form, on any conceptual form that is not just sort of piecemeal and looking at, you know, various technical aspects as the GDPR does in other areas. We'll have to address this issue of, we have a policy objective, or the United States has a policy objective, and much of the Western world has a policy objective of furthering AI in a type of geopolitical understanding. And so how do we ensure that human rights are protected while furthering this goal? Because any attempt to limit facial recognition or anything like that, that you mentioned so correctly, will potentially cause or frustrate these objectives, these political objectives. So how does the law align itself with the dual objective of protecting human rights and ensuring that the human rights that we've toiled to entrench for all these years are relevant to technological process as it defines democracies? So I know that's not an answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Karen. So our next question will be from Gadi.
I'll continue with Daphne's line, and I'll just focus on what I understand a bit better is about the legal personhood of artificial intelligence-based systems. That's my whole world at the moment. And I will say this. First, you have Ryan Abbott talked about intellectual property or rights over creations made by machines. And he tried to test the course to see if they would be given status of new inventions at some point of intellectual rights over the things they made. And at least one court, I think it was the Australian one, who answered him that the law was intended to protect human creations and not machine creations. So they went halfway. They said, yes, you create new stuff, but we never intended on promoting or protecting these types of creations. And in that aspect, it makes me think that human personhood is different from the mechanical one, as the human personhood evolves in a different way. But that also creates a problem with a different personhood. Let's say I'm copied at one point or another, and now I'm split. My digital personhood goes one way and my normal personhood goes another. Mine deteriorates or changes as my physical presence changes, the other one doesn't. And it creates. So I think that's, but it seems more like a highly theoretical problem, as we're really not there. And then everybody who does law and technology, you walk this thin line between being innovative and going sci-fi, and it goes a bit into the sci-fi realm. So I'm less worried in the next 30 years about that one. The second thing that came to mind was Pope Formosus, I think, who Pope Synod took his bones out of his tomb and tried him again for treason. Yeah, I think the story. One pope took another pope's bones, and it's the papal history has a lot of strange anecdotes, and one of them was that one took the other's bones out of the tomb and tried him for treason, and in that aspect, that could happen. Somebody could take my digital copy and ask me to answer for my sins. And the question, who would be the one coming to answer and what would happen, would be quite worrisome. And that only left me with my feelings of, I felt uneasy. There in Israel, there was this advertisement for women who were killed by their husbands. And they took their pictures and they made them talk and tell their stories about the way they were murdered. It seemed such a good cause, but it seemed so wrong. I think for many people, so in that aspect, I would say that any type of recreation of myself posthumously is a new creation which either has to get my permission as a legal, we just should decide it. I don't think it's a given morally, just to be a legal decision, whether we give this permission or not. And we could decide not to, it's okay. But I think it just has to be decided upon. That's my intuition.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because just as you said that, and here we are the creation, right? It's not that we're creating something, but that the dual, and that goes back to Graziano's quote that there will be many of us, coexist, and different versions of us. We are the creation. And when you talked about the domestic violence initiative, and it's obviously for a good cause, but it raises significant questions. I think there's something similar now being organized with the memory of the Shoah, where survivors, I don't remember at what museum they're creating, so the survivors are filming themselves, although I think there's a significant element of permission that is present, but it leads to this greater issue of what happens when you revive down the line certain political personalities for certain greater good, and how that's the very essential conflict. And the reason that I summarized the talk in a very facile way of kind of chatting with a deceased relative is because that technology is less futuristic. That is what is here already. And my hope was, not because there are issues that go far beyond that, especially in political matters, but that we can latch on to the technology that is here, which is chatting with the deceased, or having a VR experience with the deceased, or having an avatar of a deceased, or getting married in the metaverse, as has already occurred. We can latch on to these anecdotes as telling of what is greater challenges to come, and attempt to at least frame these seemingly banal interactions that will then evolve or devolve into greater challenges for the law at this stage. We kind of missed the boat, for instance, with social media, right? When it was at its very inception, and now it's much more difficult. And we're kind of missing the boat for many reasons, which I mentioned with AI. So the question is, at this stage, as we anticipate these matters, how we can reflect on legal vehicles and the consent. I participated in a book called Dementia Law, which Charles Foster and Israel Doron of Haifa. And the issue even in dementia is, how does consent alter, and which consent is the correct consent? And all these questions will come to bear. But if we begin attempting to reflect on these matters from the lens of something far less perhaps controversial, of a dead relative, than that of a political figure being resuscitated, or a victim of domestic violence being resuscitated, perhaps that will take away some of our concern and paralysis in attacking these important legal issues, even one step at a time.
Thank you very much, Karen. Gadi, you want to respond, or?
Actually, I'm anticipating to see what she thinks is a good result. I'll copy some of the good ideas.
That's a good idea, Gadi. So our next speaker, our next question will be from Dana.
Thank you very much. So it is really interesting. It's very insightful to think all of a sudden of such a topic, which seems all of more important than what I usually do in daily life. So thank you for that. And I'm just thinking, or wondering, how much. What is the difference between resuscitating a person who was actually living than just making someone up? And I think it's interesting to think whether we're thinking about, I don't know, a human right, like the deceased's right, or maybe his relative's right, or maybe it's just a social interest in the fact of not having people, I mean, because we can think of some kind of interesting hybrids between, I don't know, Einstein and Bohr or whatever, or then maybe to actually have better entities, or just taking the best parts of everyone and maybe have the better ideas or better philosophers, or and so I don't have any conclusion, but I think it helps to distinguish what it is that we're trying to protect.
Yeah, that's such an important question. And it's funny, some of my students are working on deep fakes in the context of disinformation. And that's an important question. And the distinction is also important, I suppose. And I also, the purpose is only a brainstorming. And I'm afraid I don't have any answers, but we'll send them to Gadi as soon as I do. But I think the initial concern with real people or individuals who once lived or who are alive, as opposed to deep fakes, and this is by no means an answer, but relates to Professor Shani's eloquently summarized point about this perhaps divorce it will cause between humanity and rights, which is really what I'm trying to get at in the end, because human rights have not attached posthumously, with a few small exceptions that I mentioned that are more humorous, such as in the context of posthumous marriage in France. But human rights, right? Because to me, in the end, it is about democracy accompanying technology. In the end, to me, it's just about all these questions that at least that I research relate to how democratic countries will frame this significant paradigm shift in technological revolution that accompanies every aspect of our lives. And this is just, one peak. So perhaps the difference, and there's certainly a lot of work on deep fakes and on avatars. And I had this in my notes, I didn't go into it there's an automated virtual agent for truth assessments in real time. It's a robot created by the San Diego State University to manage border controls. Right. So what rights, and there's a lot of writing on what type of rights such an avatar would have in a metaverse and what type of personality would have. And these are important issues. But my concern is a détenteur, a human rights holder who was once alive or is alive, and how the law will treat that when there is a permanent or long-lived afterlife and a significant potential for distortion, manipulation, and many other socioeconomic retombées. But definitely, it's an important, very important distinction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. So we have another question by Tomer.
Yes, hi. So it's always such a delight to hear you, Karen. So thank you for that. And I have a lot of questions, but just two for now. First, you mentioned a couple of times the transformation from consent to reactionary principles, and I really wish to see such a transformation, but I'm not sure. I know to what you are relating to. I can think about maybe the AI Act, the European AI Act in some sense, but I really want to know about other such instance. And then what do you think should be this reactionary principle in this case? And this relates to my other question, that in one sense, we can see all this Silicon Valley desire for mortality, but then we have all this cultural representation that really afraid from mortality, and maybe Tal will help us here, but like Voldemort from Harry Potter and other type. And I wonder what is the evil that those kind of cultural representations see in mortality? Maybe it can help us also with Dana's question about what is the bad here? What is the what we are afraid here? Maybe I think those movies and romance can help us to think about what we're protecting here.
Yeah, thank you, Tal. It's such important questions. I'll try to speak to the second one and then the first one, so in the opposite order. With regards to the second one and cultural representations, I think beyond the specific example of death, which I picked, to the metaverse more generally, and to the points about joblessness and socioeconomic, I think Ready Player One, the movie by Steven Spielberg, which was sort of random, and I didn't even see the whole movie as a full disclosure, is perhaps a representation of this dystopia that may be created by the metaverse, which we're very close to. Why? Because of the tremendous socioeconomic gaps were exacerbated by the pandemic in many Western democracies, where people are no longer, so just for cultural representation, people are no longer able to engage in activities or afford luxuries, either because of sanitary or health reasons, or sanitary reasons or economic reasons, or both. So the example that people, are in this little room because that's all they can afford, and they can't buy the luxury clothes, but they can buy it in the metaverse, and they can't travel, but through the metaverse, they can travel, taken further to, interacting with individuals and interacting. So to me, that cultural representation is the dystopia, which is not that unlikely given the way that we're all interacting at a very basic stage at this point, and our bodies have to some extent become superfluous, at least for professional purposes. And in terms of Silicon Valley and immortality, my concern, as with social media, 20 years ago, and I'm going on about the marketplace is gone and what will happen, and it's really nice that everyone can say what they do, but this could be distorted. So it begins as a sort of utopian idea of, why not have immortality? Why not be able to see someone dear for a last time? Why not be able to have unrestrained speech? And that's where the political and disinformation angle, which I haven't addressed in my talk, but I just want to flag, comes in, that something, beautiful can be then, or perhaps beautiful as an idea, can be taken far further from the medicine mother-in-law to resuscitating historical figures. And harnessing their words, distorting their words, and so on, and that's really endless. So I don't know if that's a proper address. As for your first question, so the first question, I'm happy to circulate the abstract of the talk that I gave last month or a few weeks ago, because that dwelled specifically on the paradigm shift and very concrete examples. And I'm not going to, with your permission, I'm going to not say anything more about it, only because having lived as a 2D type of avatar on Zoom and hoping to actually see all of you at some point in person, that will hopefully be the talk that I'm preparing to elaborate on when we next meet, which is the paradigm shift and specific illustrations of the paradigm shift, moving concretely away from consent as the pierre angulaire in the regulation of AI, to the precautionary principle and a human rights paradigm, drawing, and I'll also give this, Justice Abella is retiring at that talk, and the publication will come out of that talk, drawing on the Industrial Revolution. I'm working with a colleague whose expertise is health and safety, drawing from the paradigm shift of the Industrial Revolution in a very specific manner. But I can't give anything away because otherwise I'll have nothing to say when we next meet. But the question is very important, and I will circulate the abstract if people are interested.
Thank you very much, Karen. I see that Tal wants to re-enter the conversation, so please, Tal.
Thank you. Just kind of a quick question. What about tort law and liability? What happens if my avatar does something wrong, if it offends somebody, or if it infringes somebody's copyrights, or if it violates somebody's privacy? Who's liable?
Yeah, and that's a very important broader question. I think to me, he who has addressed this best at this stage, and there's a book, I think it's called Robotic Law. I mention him very often, a very regretted colleague, Ian Kerr, who was a pillar of internet law, if you will, or cybersecurity. And he wrote a great deal on this in the context specifically of both brain technology, and the quote that I had in my talk, technologies that will be able to retell our stories, but also in the context of medical liability. And one interesting point, and it's beyond me to speak about these issues any specifically, but a really important article he wrote with Michael Frumkin in the context of medical liability and AI. He said, what will make us liable, the way that civil liability needs to evolve, is to account for over-reliance. So when the humans are over-relying on these, be it for purposes of my talk, these people who are no longer with us to perform functions, or in his telling, just AI in medicine and robotics in medicine. So the liability, he says, we need to shift the model from one where we look at manufacturer's liability, which is kind of the current way of looking at it, at least in Canada. And there's a lot which is beyond the scope, but I have a module in my course on medical liability, and they're looking at manufacturer's liability and the chain of responsibility and going up the chain. And it's a very technical interpretation. And Ian Kerr said, look, in a principled manner, rather than taking tort law in that type of perspective, we need to look at the humans over relying on technology as a sign of negligence, which is really, to me, revolutionary, and it breaks. And this is what I hope generally to break. We're trying to preserve these old categories that the law has set for us from the Industrial Revolution. It took 100 years, I always say this, for us to adapt to the Industrial Revolution. And we've created all these wonderfully sophisticated categories and technical tests that we've perfected. And now they're on life support because they don't necessarily lend themselves to the current context. And what I think would be interesting, although bold and somewhat frightening, is for us to kind of disrupt those categories rather than attempt to maintain them artificially, talking about living forever, and say, look, it might be scary to recreate and rethink these categories, but we must, because right now we're trying to fit, I don't know if the English expression is correct, but a square peg into a round hole, or a round hole into a square, but I think you all know what I mean. So disrupting those categories is what I would urge more generally. Yeah, that's just the 1 foot rant. Oops, I think that's my doorbell.
You want to answer that?
May I go on stop video for 1 second as the as the borders between private and public are stopped? Thank you.
So we will wait for Karen to say farewell, as there are no more questions and comments. But you woke up very early for us, so it's our obligation to do so.
You can watch the plant grow behind you, Tav.
I don't think it can grow, but
behind Tomer as well. I mean, all the...
I should have left my avatar up here.
So Karen,
is it a delivery? Is it
It's a repair.
Repair. Oh.
So, yeah, no delivery. I just let it be, because otherwise it's ringing all day.
Okay, so Karen, we were very delighted to hear this presentation of your ongoing thoughts and work process. We want to thank you for joining us. It was insightful as always and delightful. And we really look forward to seeing you in Jerusalem in June, hopefully. If no new wave will come up, emerge into our life. And if so, maybe you can send an avatar to Israel and we'll see how that works. Thank you very much.
We'll stay forever.
Thank you very much, everyone. And we'll see you
so
again.
Much.
Our next session will be a joint session with the International Law Forum with Simon Chesterman. So we look forward to it. Thank you, Karen, and have a great evening, everyone, and have a great day, Karen.
Thank you so much. Purim Sameach.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.